Before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell. It's your support that allows us to bring you incredible tales like this one. Now, imagine being out in the middle of nowhere, a lone veteran facing off against two bikers who think they've found an easy target. What they don't realize is that this mom is no ordinary woman. Stay tuned for a story of strength, resilience, and a fight they'll never forget. The sun dipped low on the horizon, bathing the desolate desert in hues of orange and gold. The gas station stood like a relic of the past, its peeling paint and flickering neon sign, a reminder of a time when this highway bustled with travelers. Now it was eerily quiet, a lone sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. Ellen Sharp's truck rumbled to a stop near the ancient gas pumps. She shut off the engine, cutting the noise to reveal the deafening silence of the desert. The air was thick with heat and the faint buzz of cicadas. Ellen stepped out of the cab, her boots crunching on the gravel. She was a woman of unassuming strength, with sharp green eyes that had seen too much. Her prosthetic leg, hidden beneath her cargo pants, moved with the ease of someone who had long made peace with it. She was a veteran, a survivor, and a mother determined to rebuild her life one piece at a time. She began filling the tank, her movements deliberate as she scanned her surroundings out of habit. Ellen's military training had left her hyper-aware of her environment. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The faint rumble of engines broke the stillness. Ellen turned her head slightly, catching sight of two motorcycles approaching in the distance. Their silhouettes grew larger as they closed in, and her instincts sharpened. The bikers pulled into the station, their leather jackets adorned with patches and crude slogans. They were loud and unapologetic, the kind of men who thrived on chaos and intimidation. Ellen kept her focus on the pump, her jaw tightening as they parked on either side of her truck. "Well, look at this," one of them drawled. He was tall and wiry, with a beard that barely masked the smirk on his face. His partner, stocky with tattoos that crawled up his neck, leaned against his bike and lit a cigarette. Ellen didn't respond. She had no intention of engaging with them, but she could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up like wolves circling prey. "Hey, sweetheart," the taller one called out, his tone mocking. "Need a hand with that?" Ellen didn't flinch. "I'm good," she replied curtly, her voice calm and steady. The stocky biker chuckled, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "You sure? Looks like you could use some company." Ellen's grip tightened on the pump handle, but she kept her movements measured. She finished fueling and replaced the nozzle, her mind racing with contingency plans. "Where are you headed all alone?" the taller one pressed, taking a step closer. Ellen turned to face him, her eyes cold and unyielding. "That's none of your business." Her tone wiped the smirk off his face. The stocky biker straightened, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "You got a smart mouth for someone out here by themselves." Ellen felt the weight of her cane in her hand, the sturdy metal comforting against her palm. She didn't want trouble, but she wasn't about to be intimidated. "Move your bikes," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in life-or-death situations. The bikers exchanged a glance, their amusement turning to irritation. The taller one stepped closer, invading her space. "What if we don't?" Ellen's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "Then you'll regret it." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. The taller biker reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder. Ellen reacted instinctively. She stepped back and raised her cane, the metal glinting in the fading sunlight. "Touch me, and you'll regret it even more," she warned, her voice like steel. The stocky biker laughed nervously, but there was an edge to his voice now. "She's got some fight in her, huh?" Ellen didn't reply. She kept her stance solid, her eyes never leaving them. Years of combat had taught her the importance of control, and she wasn't about to give it up now. The taller biker sneered, his bravado faltering. "We'll see you around, sweetheart," he said, stepping back. Ellen didn't move until they returned to their bikes. The engines roared to life, and they sped off, their laughter echoing in the distance. But Ellen knew they weren't gone for good. Men like that didn't let go of a challenge so easily. She climbed back into her truck, her pulse steady despite the encounter. As she pulled out of the gas station, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert. Ellen tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her instincts telling her this was far from over. The highway stretched out endlessly before Ellen, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. She drove with purpose, the encounter at the gas station already fading into the background noise of a life filled with challenges. Yet, in the back of her mind, a faint unease lingered. The bikers had retreated, but not because they were afraid. Ellen knew their type, bullies who thrived on dominance. They didn't back down, they regrouped. The first sign came 15 minutes later. The distant hum of engines drifted through the desert air, faint but growing louder. Ellen glanced in her rearview mirror, her heart sinking as two small dots appeared on the horizon. "Here we go," she muttered under her breath, tightening her grip on the wheel. The bikers were back. They approached swiftly, their motorcycles cutting through the desert silence like predators closing in on prey. Ellen kept her speed steady, refusing to let panic take over. She had been in worse situations, combat zones where survival required a clear head and quick thinking. This was no different. The tall biker pulled up alongside her truck, grinning as he matched her speed. He tapped on her window with a crowbar, the sound sharp and jarring. Ellen glanced at him but said nothing, her expression cold and unreadable. "Pull over," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Ellen ignored him, her eyes flicking between the road and her surroundings. The stocky biker moved up on the other side, his motorcycle swerving dangerously close to her tires. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be," he called out, brandishing a knife. Ellen's jaw tightened. She slowed the truck slightly, calculating her next move. The road was empty, with nothing but desert for miles. They had her cornered, or so they thought. The stocky biker made the first aggressive move, veering closer to her truck and scraping his knife along the side of the vehicle. The screech of metal on metal sent a shiver down Ellen's spine, but she didn't react. Instead, she tapped the brakes lightly, causing him to overcompensate and swerve. The tall biker roared with laughter, emboldened by what he thought was Ellen's hesitance. He swung his crowbar, shattering the side mirror. Ellen's pulse quickened, but her focus remained razor sharp. She glanced ahead and spotted a turnoff, a dirt road leading toward a cluster of rocky outcroppings. It wasn't ideal, but it was her best option. She swerved sharply, her truck kicking up a cloud of dust as she left the highway. The bikers hesitated for a moment before following, their engines roaring louder as they gave chase. Ellen pushed the truck hard, the tires struggling against the uneven terrain. She scanned the area, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. Her eyes landed on a narrow pass between two large rock formations, a natural choke point. She gunned the engine, aiming for the gap. The bikers followed, their shouts and laughter echoing behind her. The pass was tighter than Ellen expected, the rocks towering on either side like walls. She slowed just enough to navigate the narrow path, her truck scraping against the jagged edges. The bikers were forced to slow down, their bikes not built for the rough terrain. Ellen used the opportunity to put some distance between them, emerging into a small clearing surrounded by boulders. She stopped the truck and grabbed her emergency kit from the passenger seat. Her fingers closed around the flare gun, its weight reassuring in her hand. She tucked it into her belt and stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching against the gravel. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, the bikers closing in. Ellen moved quickly, positioning herself behind a large boulder. Her military training kicked in, every movement calculated and precise. The tall biker arrived first, skidding to a halt in the clearing. He dismounted, his crowbar in hand, and scanned the area. "Where are you hiding, sweetheart?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "This game of hide-and-seek is getting old." The stocky biker joined him moments later, his knife gleaming in the dim light. "Maybe she ran off," he said, his tone laced with disdain. Ellen took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She knew the key to survival was staying calm and controlling the situation. From her position behind the boulder, she raised the flare gun and fired. The flare shot into the air, its blinding light illuminating the clearing. The bikers flinched, momentarily disoriented. Ellen moved swiftly, using the distraction to her advantage. She stepped out from behind the boulder, wielding her cane like a weapon. The tall biker recovered first, swinging his crowbar toward her. Ellen ducked, the metal whistling past her head. She countered with a sharp jab to his ribs, her prosthetic leg giving her added stability. He stumbled back, cursing, as the stocky biker lunged at her. Ellen sidestepped him, using her cane to sweep his legs out from under him. "You messed with the wrong person," she said coldly, standing over him as he scrambled to his feet. The bikers regrouped, their bravado faltering as they realized they were up against someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. "You'll pay for this," the tall one snarled, clutching his side. Ellen didn't respond. She stood her ground, her stance firm and her eyes unwavering. She wasn't running anymore. Ellen stood motionless, her chest rising and falling in measured breaths as she watched the two bikers retreat slightly, regrouping near their motorcycles. The tall one paced, gripping his crowbar with white-knuckled fury, while the stocky one rubbed his shoulder where her cane had landed a solid blow. They weren't used to resistance, especially not from someone like her, a lone woman in the middle of the desert. But Ellen wasn't just anyone. The taller biker spat on the ground, his voice carrying across the clearing. "You think this is over? Lady, you're dead. You hear me?" Ellen didn't flinch. Her steely gaze met his. "You're welcome to try again, but you might want to ask your friend how that worked out." Her calmness only enraged him further. He pointed the crowbar at her. "Get on your bike," he barked at his partner. "We'll run her off the road this time." Ellen took a step back toward her truck, her mind racing. She could see the faint outline of the road she'd left behind, barely visible in the distance. If she could make it back to the highway, she might have a chance of finding help, or at least a place where their reckless behavior would draw attention. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Ellen climbed into the cab of her truck. She grabbed the flare gun from her belt, resting it on the passenger seat for easy reach. The engine roared to life, and she threw the truck into gear just as the bikers sped toward her. The clearing was tight, forcing Ellen to maneuver carefully around the boulders as the bikers closed in. The tall one swung his crowbar at the side of her truck, the metallic clang reverberating through the cabin. Ellen gritted her teeth, gripping the wheel tighter. The stocky biker pulled up alongside her window, slapping his palm against the glass. "You can't run forever," he shouted, his knife gleaming in the dim light. Ellen slammed the brakes, causing the truck to lurch backward. The sudden move caught him off guard, his motorcycle wobbling as he veered away. She shifted gears again, pressing the accelerator hard and tearing out of the clearing. The bikers gave chase, their engines roaring louder as they gained on her. Ellen's truck bounced and jolted over the uneven desert terrain, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. Her hands were steady, her mind focused on the stretch of highway growing closer with every second. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The tall biker was gaining, his crowbar raised as he approached the truck's bed. He swung, the metal bar scraping against the rear bumper. Ellen jerked the wheel, causing the truck to fishtail and forcing him to back off slightly. Her focus shifted to the road ahead. The highway loomed closer, its flat expanse cutting through the desert like a lifeline. But getting there wouldn't be enough. She needed a plan. Ellen scanned the dashboard, her eyes landing on the emergency brake lever. An idea formed. A risky one, but it was all she had. She slowed slightly, letting the bikers draw closer. The tall one pulled alongside her, his crowbar poised to strike the truck's window. Ellen counted down in her head. 3, 2, 1. She yanked the emergency brake, causing the truck to skid violently. Dust and gravel exploded into the air as the vehicle spun sideways. The sudden move sent the bikers scrambling. The stocky one swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision, while the tall one lost control completely. His motorcycle skidded out from under him, sending him tumbling across the ground. Ellen released the brake and hit the accelerator, her truck roaring forward toward the highway. The stocky biker hesitated, glancing back at his fallen partner before roaring after her. Ellen knew she had only seconds before he caught up. She reached for the flare gun, gripping it tightly as her truck hit the smooth asphalt of the highway. She glanced in the mirror. The stocky biker was closing in, his face twisted with rage. Ellen steadied her breathing, her military instincts taking over. She slowed slightly, letting him approach. When he was within striking distance, she rolled down the window and aimed the flare gun. The shot rang out, the flare streaking through the air like a blazing comet. The biker swerved, the sudden burst of light disorienting him. He lost control, his motorcycle veering off the road and into the desert brush. Ellen didn't wait to see if he recovered. She pressed the accelerator, her truck barreling down the highway. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, her heart pounding as the desert stretched out ahead of her. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a flicker of relief. But it was short-lived. In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared on the horizon. A vehicle, large and fast, was heading her way. Ellen's stomach tightened as the shape came into focus. It wasn't a car. It was a van. And it was moving toward her with purpose. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The bikers weren't alone. The van's headlights cut through the darkness, growing larger with every passing second. Ellen tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening as she calculated her options. The van was coming straight toward her, and from its speed and erratic movement, it was clear whoever was driving wasn't just passing through. They were part of the biker's crew. She glanced in her rearview mirror. The stocky biker was regaining control of his motorcycle, his headlight bobbing wildly as he roared back onto the road. Ellen was caught in the middle, and her instincts screamed at her to act fast. With a sharp turn of the wheel, she swerved off the highway and onto a dirt path that cut through the desert. The van skidded to a halt where she had been moments earlier, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust as it turned to follow. The motorcycle's engine roared louder behind her, the biker closing the gap. Ellen's truck jolted violently over the uneven terrain, her body shaking with every bump. She clenched her jaw, her mind racing for a solution. She knew she couldn't outrun them forever. Her truck wasn't built for this kind of chase, and the bikers were relentless. Ahead, the dirt path curved sharply around a cluster of rocks. Ellen's eyes darted toward the terrain, scanning for anything she could use to her advantage. Her gaze locked onto a narrow passage between two large boulders, barely wide enough for her truck. She pressed the accelerator, aiming for the gap. The truck scraped against the jagged edges of the rocks, sparks flying as she forced the vehicle through. On the other side, she found herself in a small clearing surrounded by towering stones. Ellen slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. She jumped out, grabbing her emergency kit from the passenger seat. Her fingers closed around the flare gun, and she stuffed it into her belt alongside the wrench she'd used earlier. She moved quickly, her boots crunching against the gravel as she climbed onto one of the larger rocks. From her elevated position, she had a clear view of the clearing and the narrow passage she had just driven through. Moments later, the stocky biker emerged, his motorcycle skidding to a stop as he scanned the area. The van wasn't far behind, its headlights illuminating the clearing as it barreled into view. Ellen crouched low, her breathing steady as she waited for the right moment to strike. The biker dismounted, his knife gleaming in the harsh light of the van's beams. The driver of the van stepped out, a burly man with a shaved head and a shotgun slung over his shoulder. He barked orders to the biker, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Find her. She's on foot now. Check behind those rocks." The biker nodded and began searching, his movements cautious but determined. Ellen watched from her vantage point, her mind racing. She had the element of surprise, but she needed to act quickly before they discovered her. As the biker moved closer to her position, Ellen raised the flare gun. She aimed for the ground near his feet and fired. The flare exploded in a burst of light and heat, startling the biker and forcing him to stumble back. He cursed loudly, shielding his eyes as the light blinded him. The driver of the van shouted in alarm, raising his shotgun as he searched for the source of the flare. Ellen used the distraction to climb down from her perch, moving silently through the shadows. She approached the van from the side, her wrench clutched tightly in her hand. The driver was focused on the flare's fading light, his shotgun sweeping the area in search of movement. Ellen crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. When she was within striking distance, she swung the wrench with all her strength, hitting the shotgun and knocking it from his hands. The man shouted in surprise, spinning toward her, but Ellen was already moving. She jabbed the wrench into his stomach, sending him doubling over in pain. The stocky biker, still recovering from the flare, turned toward the commotion. He saw Ellen and charged, his knife raised. Ellen sidestepped his attack, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as he cried out in pain. She delivered a swift kick with her prosthetic leg, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling onto the dirt. The driver recovered quickly, lunging for his shotgun. Ellen reacted instantly, kicking the weapon out of reach and delivering a solid blow to his jaw with the wrench. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Breathing heavily, Ellen grabbed the shotgun and checked the van. The keys were still in the ignition. The stocky biker groaned, struggling to his feet. Ellen pointed the shotgun at him, her expression cold and unyielding. "Get on your bike and leave," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "And tell your friends to stay out of my way." The biker hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the unconscious driver. He seemed to consider his options before finally backing away. "You're making a big mistake," he spat, climbing onto his motorcycle. "This isn't over." He revved the engine and sped off into the night, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Ellen exhaled slowly, lowering the shotgun. She glanced down at the unconscious man at her feet and shook her head. "This was over the moment you came after me," she muttered. The desert was eerily silent now, broken only by the soft hum of Ellen's truck engine. She stood beside the van, the shotgun still in her hands, and scanned the horizon. The stocky biker had disappeared into the darkness, and the unconscious driver remained sprawled on the ground. Ellen's mind raced. She couldn't stay here long. The remaining biker was likely regrouping or calling for reinforcements, and she had no intention of sticking around to see what came next. She glanced at the van. It was damaged but functional, tires intact, engine still running. She checked the cab, finding a phone on the dashboard and a crumpled map shoved into the glove box. Her military training kicked in as she quickly assessed her options. The truck was her safest bet for mobility, but the van might hold clues to who these men were and why they were so intent on targeting her. Ellen grabbed the map, tucking it into her backpack, and rifled through the van's contents. Among empty cans and cigarette butts, she found a notepad with scrawled messages. Most of it was indecipherable, but one phrase caught her attention. "Route 67, 3 a.m., drop." Her eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a random group of bikers looking for trouble. They were part of something bigger. But right now, staying alive was her priority. Ellen climbed back into her truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She threw it into reverse, backing away from the van and its unconscious driver. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The vast expanse of desert loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. Just as she prepared to drive off, a new sound shattered the quiet. A low rumble, distant but unmistakable. Motorcycles. Her stomach tightened. The reinforcements had arrived. The roar of engines grew louder, and soon the headlights of at least 3 motorcycles pierced the darkness. Ellen's pulse quickened, but her mind remained focused. She had faced worse odds before, and she wasn't about to let fear dictate her actions. She turned the truck sharply, heading back toward the narrow pass between the boulders. It was her only advantage. The tight space would slow them down, giving her time to think. The bikers followed, their headlights bouncing erratically over the uneven terrain. Ellen's truck scraped against the rocks as she navigated the pass, the sound grating but familiar. She reached the clearing on the other side and slammed the brakes. The bikers emerged moments later, their engines reverberating through the air. They spread out, circling her truck like predators surrounding prey. Ellen took a deep breath. This was it, the turning point. She reached for the flare gun, her fingers tightening around the grip. One of the bikers dismounted, his leather jacket glinting in the moonlight. He was taller than the others, with a face hardened by years of violence. He stepped forward, a chain coiled loosely in his hand. "You've caused a lot of trouble tonight," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But it ends here." Ellen opened the truck door slowly, stepping out with the shotgun in hand. She kept the flare gun tucked into her belt, hidden but within reach. "Does it?" she replied, her tone calm but laced with defiance. The man smirked. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered and out of options." Ellen took a step forward, her eyes locked onto his. "Maybe you should have brought more men." The smirk faltered. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering under the weight of her unshakable resolve. "Last chance," the leader growled. "Drop the gun and walk away." Ellen didn't hesitate. She raised the shotgun and fired into the air, the deafening blast echoing through the clearing. The bikers flinched, their bravado crumbling. "You're going to leave," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. "Now." The leader hesitated, his grip on the chain tightening. For a moment, Ellen thought he might attack, but then he stepped back, motioning for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he said, his tone dark. It is for tonight, Ellen replied, her gaze never leaving his. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. Ellen lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. She climbed back into her truck, her body aching from the tension of the encounter. As she drove away from the clearing, the words Route 67 3 a.m. drop echoed in her mind. Whatever these men were involved in, she had inadvertently stumbled into something much bigger than herself. But for now, she had survived. And that was enough. The open desert stretched endlessly in front of Ellen as she guided her truck back onto the highway. Her body ached, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension of the last encounter. The phrase she had found in the van, Route 67, 3 a.m. drop, was etched into her mind, raising more questions than answers. She didn't want to be part of their world, but it was clear now. She was already in the middle of it. Her rearview mirror reflected only darkness, and for the first time in hours, the hum of her truck's engine was the only sound. The bikers seemed to have retreated for now, but Ellen wasn't naive enough to believe they were gone for good. People like them didn't give up. They regrouped, rearmed, and returned with a vengeance. Ahead, a small rest stop appeared, a decrepit diner with a couple of parked cars and flickering neon signs that read, "Open 24 hours." Ellen pulled into the lot, scanning her surroundings carefully before shutting off the engine. She needed a moment to regroup, to plan her next move. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was as still as the desert night. A waitress with tired eyes poured coffee for a lone trucker sitting at the counter. Ellen slid into a booth near the window, her back to the wall, and ordered a coffee she didn't intend to drink. She needed to think. The waitress returned with her coffee, setting it down with a faint smile. Ellen nodded her thanks and turned her attention to the small notepad she'd taken from the van. She flipped through the pages again, her eyes tracing the scrawled handwriting. Route 67, 3 a.m. Drop. It was 2:15 a.m. If she headed there now, she could see for herself what these bikers were involved in, but that meant walking straight into their world. She weighed her options, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. The door of the diner swung open, the jingling bell snapping her out of her thoughts. Two men walked in, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. Ellen's eyes narrowed as recognition struck, the stocky biker and the leader from earlier. They hadn't given up after all. They didn't seem to notice her right away, scanning the room before taking a seat at the counter. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained unreadable. She shifted slightly, ensuring her cane and the flare gun tucked into her bag were within reach. The waitress approached the men, pouring them coffee. They exchanged a few words, their voices low, but audible in the otherwise silent diner. Ellen caught snippets of their conversation. "She can't be far," the stocky one said, his voice tinged with frustration. "The van's busted, and the truck's too recognizable. She'll slip up," the leader grunted in response, sipping his coffee. "She's a problem we'll deal with tonight. The drop comes first." Ellen's stomach tightened. The drop. It was happening soon, and whatever it involved, these men would do anything to keep it going smoothly. She knew she should slip out unnoticed, avoid confrontation, and drive away. But something deeper inside her refused to let this go. She didn't just want to survive tonight. She wanted to end it. Ellen slid out of the booth as quietly as possible, leaving a couple of bills on the table. She moved toward the back exit, the soft creak of the door barely audible over the hum of the diner. Once outside, she climbed into her truck and pulled out her map. Route 67 was close, just a few miles up the highway. If she hurried, she could intercept them before they reached their destination. The drive was tense, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from the faint glow of her headlights. She turned onto Route 67, a narrow, winding road flanked by jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. The clock on her dashboard read 2:50 a.m. Ahead, she spotted faint lights in the distance, a small cluster of vehicles parked in a clearing. Ellen pulled off the road, killing her engine and stepping out into the darkness. She moved cautiously, her flare gun in one hand and the wrench tucked into her belt. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel as she approached the scene. The clearing was a hive of activity. Several men moved between two trucks, unloading crates and stacking them onto the ground. Ellen crouched behind a rock, her eyes scanning the scene. The stocky biker and the leader were there, along with a handful of others she didn't recognize. They were armed, their voices low but commanding as they worked. Ellen's eyes darted to the crates. She couldn't make out what was inside, but the secrecy and urgency of their actions told her it wasn't anything legal. Drugs? Weapons? She didn't know, and she didn't care. What mattered was stopping them. She crept closer, her heart pounding as she calculated her next move. She spotted a fuel drum near one of the trucks, its nozzle dripping slightly onto the ground. An idea formed in her mind. Dangerous, but effective. She raised the flare gun, aiming for the ground near the drum. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but she hesitated. This would escalate things far beyond a simple act of self-defense. It would be a declaration of war. But then she thought of the nights she'd spent sleepless, her son asking why she couldn't be home more often. The sacrifices she'd made for a country that had left her with scars, both visible and hidden. She couldn't let these men win. With a deep breath, she pulled the trigger. The flare shot through the air, landing inches from the fuel drum. Flames erupted instantly, licking at the side of the truck and spreading rapidly. Shouts filled the clearing as the men scrambled to contain the blaze. Ellen didn't wait to see the aftermath. She turned and ran, the fire illuminating her path back to the truck. The roar of engines and the shouts of angry voices followed her, but she didn't look back. This wasn't over yet. Ellen's truck tore down the deserted road, the glow of flames from the clearing fading into the distance behind her. She gripped the wheel tightly, her breathing heavy but steady. She'd done what she could to disrupt the bikers' operation, but she knew it wasn't enough to stop them completely. They would come for her, angrier and more dangerous than ever. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant roar of motorcycles. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching the unmistakable glint of headlights on the horizon. They were coming, fast. Ellen pushed the truck to its limits, the engine groaning as it sped along the uneven road. The narrow highway twisted through the desert, flanked by jagged rocks that loomed like shadows in the darkness. She scanned the terrain for anything she could use to her advantage. Running wasn't enough anymore. She needed to end this. The headlights behind her grew brighter, the sound of engines filling the air like an approaching storm. Ellen's stomach tightened as she counted at least 4 sets of lights. They had regrouped, bringing reinforcements. The lead motorcycle pulled alongside her, the stocky biker from earlier glaring at her through the window. His knife flashed in the dim light as he shouted something she couldn't hear over the roar of the wind. He swung the blade, scraping the truck's side panel with a screech of metal on metal. Ellen jerked the wheel, swerving hard toward him. The truck clipped his motorcycle, sending it wobbling. The biker managed to steady himself, but his expression twisted into fury. He fell back momentarily, replaced by another rider. This one armed with a chain he swung menacingly in her direction. The chain cracked against the truck's windshield, leaving a spiderweb of fractures. Ellen flinched, but kept her focus, her mind racing. She couldn't keep this up for long. Her truck wasn't built for combat, and the bikers were relentless. Ahead, the road narrowed into a sharp curve bordered by a steep drop-off on one side and a rock face on the other. Ellen's eyes darted to the rocky terrain, an idea forming in her mind. It was risky, but it might be her only chance. She slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just before the curve. The bikers swerved wildly, caught off guard by her sudden stop. One of them lost control entirely, skidding off the road and into the ditch. The others quickly regrouped, circling back toward her like wolves closing in for the kill. Ellen threw the truck into reverse, backing up until the rear bumper rested against the rock face. She grabbed the shotgun from the passenger seat and stepped out, her boots hitting the ground with purpose. This time, she wasn't running. The leader of the group, the tall biker with the chain, dismounted his motorcycle. He approached slowly, his posture radiating menace. The others followed his lead, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You just made this personal." Ellen leveled the shotgun at him, her stance solid. "It became personal when you came after me." The biker smirked, gesturing to his crew. "You think you can take all of us with that? You're outnumbered, lady." Ellen's lips curled into a faint smile. Numbers don't mean much when you don't know how to fight. The smirk vanished. The leader lunged, swinging his chain with deadly precision. Ellen ducked, the chain whistling past her head, and fired the shotgun into the air. The deafening blast echoed through the canyon, momentarily freezing the bikers in their tracks. She used the opening to move, stepping to the side and aiming the shotgun at the fuel tank of one of their motorcycles. She pulled the trigger. The tank erupted in flames, the explosion throwing the nearest bikers off balance. Shouts and curses filled the air as the remaining bikers scrambled. Ellen kept moving, using the rocky terrain to her advantage. She fired again, this time hitting the ground near the leader's feet. He stumbled, dropping the chain as he regained his footing. "You're done," Ellen said coldly, her voice carrying over the chaos. The leader's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "Not yet." He lunged again, this time unarmed. But Ellen was ready. She sidestepped him, using her prosthetic leg to deliver a powerful kick to his midsection. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. Ellen turned her gaze to them, the shotgun still in her hands. "Leave," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Unless you want to end up like him." One by one, the bikers mounted their motorcycles, their bravado crumbling under her unrelenting stare. The leader struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs, and glared at her with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, climbing onto the back of one of the motorcycles. Ellen watched silently as they sped off into the night, their taillights fading into the distance. She lowered the shotgun, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The desert was silent again, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She leaned against the truck, her mind racing with the events of the night. She'd won, for now, but something told her this wasn't the end of their story. The desert sky began to lighten, the faint glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. Ellen sat in the driver's seat of her truck, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind alert. The events of the night played over and over in her head. The relentless bikers, the fire, the final showdown. She had survived, but she knew she couldn't just drive away and hope this all went away. These men wouldn't stop. They were part of something bigger, and she had inadvertently become a threat to their operation. Running wasn't an option anymore. It was time to end this, once and for all. Ellen pulled out the notepad she had taken from the van. The scribbled message, Route 67 3 a.m. drop, had led her to uncover part of their operation, but she needed to know more. She flipped to another page, her eyes scanning the messy handwriting. There it was, a name scrawled hastily in the margins. Red Rock Depot. Her mind raced. Red Rock Depot was a well-known abandoned freight yard on the outskirts of the desert, miles away from the nearest town. It was the perfect place for illegal activities, isolated, quiet, and off the radar. If the bikers had retreated anywhere, it was there. Ellen started the truck, her grip firm on the wheel as she turned back onto the road. The sun was rising now, casting long shadows across the desert. She drove with purpose, her exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline took over. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back control. The freight yard came into view an hour later, its skeletal structures looming like ghosts against the pale morning light. Ellen parked her truck behind a line of rusting train cars, stepping out with her shotgun slung over her shoulder and the flare gun tucked into her belt. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady as she moved toward the yard. She could hear them before she saw them, the low rumble of voices and the occasional clang of metal. The bikers were here, regrouping after the chaos she'd caused earlier. Ellen crouched behind an old shipping container, peeking out to assess the scene. There were 6 of them, including the stocky biker and the leader. They were gathered near a flatbed truck, its bed loaded with crates similar to the ones she had seen the night before. 2 of the men were arguing, their gestures animated, while the others stood watch. Ellen's eyes narrowed. She couldn't take them all head on, not without backup she didn't have, but she didn't need to fight them directly. She just needed to destroy whatever they were protecting. Her gaze landed on a stack of fuel drums near the flatbed truck. A plan formed in her mind, risky but effective. She gripped the flare gun tightly, her breathing steady as she prepared to move. Ellen crept closer, using the shadows to her advantage. The men were too distracted by their argument to notice her, their voices rising as tempers flared. She reached the stack of fuel drums, crouching low as she aimed the flare gun. Her hands were steady, her focus unshakable. She pulled the trigger. The flare arced through the air, landing directly on the drums. The explosion was instantaneous, a deafening roar that shook the ground and sent flames shooting skyward. The bikers shouted in alarm, scrambling for cover as the fire consumed their operation. Ellen didn't wait to see the full extent of the destruction. She turned and ran, her boots pounding against the ground as the chaos unfolded behind her. The sound of the explosion faded as she climbed into her truck and started the engine. The bikers were scattered now, their operation in ruins. They wouldn't be able to recover from this easily, and Ellen knew it. She had hit them where it hurt, and they wouldn't forget it. As she drove away from the depot, the weight of the night began to settle on her. She was alive, and she had won. But she knew this wasn't just a victory for herself. It was a statement. She wasn't someone to be underestimated or pushed aside. She was a survivor, a fighter, and someone who wouldn't back down, no matter the odds. The desert stretched out before her, vast and empty, but filled with possibility. Ellen tightened her grip on the wheel, her resolve stronger than ever. The bikers might still come after her, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced worse and come out stronger every time. For now, she would return to her son, her reason for fighting and surviving. She had stories to tell, lessons to pass on, and if the bikers ever crossed her path again, she would be ready. The sun rose higher, casting the desert in golden light as Ellen drove toward the horizon. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long while, she felt truly free. If this story inspired you, remember, true strength lies in standing up for yourself, no matter how tough the odds. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and resilience. See you in the next one.